I heard my name before I saw the warning. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't in the room. It was inside me, low and steady, like something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. Emily. The cursor on my monitor froze, blinking once, then twice, before the entire system flickered into a state I had never seen before. Unauthorized neural sync detected. The words appeared in sharp white text across every screen in the control bay. My breath caught. I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't entered a command. And yet, the system was reacting to me. I pushed back from my chair, the wheels rolling a few inches across the polished floor, my pulse climbing faster than it should for a quiet night shift. This building was supposed to be secure. Sealed. No external signals, no internal anomalies. That's what they told us. That's what I believed, until now. Emily. The voice came again, softer this time, almost familiar. I turned toward the far end of the room where a restricted corridor sat behind reinforced glass. The door at the end of it, steel, matte black, marked with clearance levels I didn't have, glowed faintly, like it was responding. That door had never opened. Not in the 3 years I'd worked here. Not for anyone. My feet moved before my mind caught up. One step, then another. Each one felt heavier, like I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to walk back from. The overhead lights dimmed as I approached, reacting in sync with the rising hum in the walls. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant the voice or myself. The system didn't respond with an error. It responded with silence. And then, with a quiet click, the sealed door unlocked. The lock disengaged with a sound so soft it almost felt imagined, like the building itself was holding its breath. And for a second, I just stood there staring at the door, because this was not supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen, and every protocol I had ever memorized was screaming at me to step back, to report it, to walk away before I crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, but my hand was already reaching forward before logic could catch up, fingers brushing the cold metal surface as it slid open on its own, revealing a corridor I had only ever seen on restricted blueprints, long and narrow and impossibly clean, the kind of sterile that made you feel like you did not belong there, like the air itself was filtering you out. And yet the voice came again, quieter now, but closer, guiding instead of calling. "Emily." And I stepped inside. The door sealed behind me with a finality that echoed in my chest, heavier than the sound itself. And the moment it did, the world outside disappeared. No system alerts, no distant hum of servers, just a low, steady vibration running through the walls like a heartbeat that did not belong to me. And I realized I could not hear my own breathing anymore, because something else was sinking over it, matching my rhythm, adjusting it, pulling me deeper with every step I took down that corridor. The lights overhead flickered, not randomly, but in sequence, each one turning on just as I approached, like the space was waking up for me, recognizing me in a way that made my stomach tighten with something I could not name. Because this place should not know me. I had never been cleared for this level. I had never even seen this door open. And yet nothing was stopping me. Nothing was asking for credentials. Nothing was resisting my presence. And that was worse than any alarm could have been. Halfway down the corridor I paused, my hand pressing lightly against the wall as a sudden wave of dizziness hit. Not painful, not sharp, just disorienting, like stepping into a memory that did not fully belong to me. Flashes of white light, distant voices, a sensation of being watched not from the outside, but from within, and I squeezed my eyes shut for a second trying to steady myself, telling myself this was just stress, just adrenaline, just my brain reacting to something unfamiliar. But when I opened them again, the corridor was still there, still, waiting, still pulling, and the voice did not fade. It grew clearer, steadier, like it had been distorted before and was finally aligning. "Almost there," it said, and I did not question it. I could not question it, because something in me recognized the tone even if my mind did not. The corridor ended in a wide chamber that opened up suddenly, the ceiling higher than anything else in the building, smooth white surfaces curving in ways that made it hard to tell where the walls ended and the floor began. And at the center of it all was the core, not the abstract concept we talked about in training, but something physical, real, a structure of layered light and glass that pulsed slowly, like it was alive, like it was breathing. And the moment I stepped into the room, the pulse shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to notice, sinking again, matching something inside me with a precision that made my chest tighten. I stopped a few feet inside, my eyes scanning the space, trying to understand, trying to anchor myself in something logical, because none of this made sense. None of this followed the rules I had built my entire career around. And then I saw him. He stood on the far side of the core, partially turned away, his posture relaxed but deliberate, like someone who did not need to rush, like someone who already knew exactly what was happening. And for a moment I thought he had not noticed me, that I still had time to step back, to leave before this became something irreversible. But then the core pulsed again, brighter this time, and his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. And I felt it too, that same alignment, that same invisible thread tightening between us. And before I could move, before I could speak, he turned. His gaze found me instantly, not searching, not surprised, just precise, as if I had always been exactly where he expected me to be. And the air in the room shifted in a way I could not explain, heavier, charged, like everything had been building to this exact moment. And for the first time since the door opened, the voice in my head went silent, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat crashing back into awareness as I realized one thing with absolute certainty. I had not found this place by accident, and whatever had been calling me here had led me straight to him. He did not move toward me right away, and somehow that made it worse, because the distance between us felt intentional, measured, like he was giving me just enough space to realize there was nowhere else to go. And I stood there frozen with my hands slightly trembling at my sides, trying to remember how to breathe normally while his eyes held mine with a focus that felt almost unreal, like he was not just seeing me, but reading something beneath the surface, something I did not even know existed. And when he finally took a step forward, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor echoed through the chamber in a way that made the silence heavier, not louder, just more absolute. "You are not supposed to be afraid," he said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to command attention. And it hit me with a strange familiarity that made my chest tighten, because I knew that tone, not from memory exactly, but from something deeper, something that lived just out of reach. And I swallowed hard before answering, my own voice unsteady despite my effort to sound composed. "I did not mean to come here," which was the truth, or at least the version of the truth I could understand. But his expression did not change, not even slightly, as if my words had no weight in this room, as if intention did not matter here. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough now that I could see the details I had missed before, the sharp precision in his features, the calm intensity in his gaze, and something else beneath it, something quieter but more dangerous, like patience stretched over years. And when he spoke again, there was a faint shift in his tone, not softer exactly, but more certain. "You did not come here by mistake." And the way he said it made it sound like a fact, not an opinion, like he had already decided the truth of it long before I ever walked through that door. I shook my head instinctively, taking a small step back, even though I knew it would not create real distance. "I followed a signal," I said, the words coming out faster now, like if I could explain it clearly enough it would make sense. "Something called my name. I thought it was a system error. I did not even know this place existed." And for the first time something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition, like I had confirmed something he had already suspected. And his gaze flickered briefly past me toward the core before returning to my face with sharper focus. "It called you," he repeated quietly, and there was something in those words that made my pulse spike, because he did not sound confused. He sounded satisfied. And that should not have made sense. None of this should have made sense. And yet the longer I stood here, the more it felt like I was the only one who did not understand what was happening. The core pulsed again behind him, brighter this time, and the light reflected faintly in his eyes, creating a moment where it looked like something was moving beneath the surface, something alive. And I felt it again, that same pull, stronger now, like a thread tightening between my chest and the center of the room. And I instinctively pressed a hand against my sternum as if that could ground me, as if I could hold myself in place. But it did nothing. The connection did not weaken, it deepened. And he noticed, of course he noticed, because his gaze dropped briefly to where my hand rested before lifting back to my eyes with a clarity that made my breath catch. "You feel it," he said, not a question, And I hesitated for half a second before nodding, because there was no point denying something that obvious. And his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, like he was holding something back, something he was not ready to say yet. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was calm, but because something inside me knew that raising it would not help, that this was not a situation I could control by force or volume. And he studied me for a long moment before answering. And when he did, his voice dropped just enough to make the words feel heavier, more deliberate. "This is the center of everything. They tried to control," he said, and there was a subtle emphasis on the word "they" that made my mind catch on it. Because whoever they were, he did not include himself among them, and that realization shifted something in my understanding, even if only slightly. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but before I could, the core reacted again, the pulse sharp and sudden, and a stream of light traced outward across the floor in intricate patterns that moved faster than I could track, converging toward me with an accuracy that felt intentional, and I froze as the line stopped just inches from my feet, glowing softly, waiting, and the air in the room seemed to hold still around us, as if even the space itself was watching what would happen next. He stepped closer then, closing the remaining distance between us with a calm certainty that made it impossible to misread his intent. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silence with absolute clarity. "Do you understand now?" he said, and I shook my head slowly because I did not. I really did not. Not fully. Not in a way that made sense, but something in me was starting to align, starting to recognize patterns I had never consciously seen before, and that was more unsettling than ignorance ever could be. He lifted his hand then, slowly enough that I had time to react if I wanted to, but I did not move. I could not move, because something deeper than fear held me in place, and his fingers stopped just short of touching mine, a fraction of an inch that felt more significant than actual contact. And for a moment neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, and then he exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, as if something had finally settled into place. "There you are," he said, and the words sent a chill down my spine because they were not addressed to the person I thought I was. They were addressed to something else, something he had been waiting for, and before I could ask what he meant, the system behind him activated, a series of symbols and data streams rising into the air in a holographic display that surrounded us both, and at the center of it all, unmistakable and undeniable, was my name, highlighted in stark white text with a designation that made my stomach drop, primary key, and the moment I saw it, I knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt. This place had not just been waiting for me, it had been built with me in mind. The word primary did not fade when I blinked. It stayed there suspended in the air like a verdict I had not agreed to, and my first instinct was to step back, to put distance between myself and whatever this system thought I was. But my feet refused to move, not because something was physically stopping me, but because something deeper held me in place, something that felt disturbingly familiar, like standing in a room I had forgotten, but my body remembered, and my voice came out quieter than I expected. "That is not possible, because it could not be. I was a technician, a background function in a system I barely had clearance to maintain, not the center of it, not the key to anything. And yet the display did not change, the text did not flicker or correct itself. It remained stable, confident, undeniable." He watched me carefully as I processed it, his gaze tracking every shift in my expression. And there was no confusion in his eyes, no hesitation, only a steady certainty that made my chest tighten, because he had seen this before, not the moment exactly but the outcome, and that realization settled in slowly, like a weight I could not shake. "It is possible," he said, his tone calm, almost measured, but beneath it there was something else, something restrained, like he was choosing his words with more care than the situation demanded, and I shook my head again, more firmly this time, because I needed something to push against, something solid. "No, you do not understand. I have never been here. I have never even heard of this system outside of restricted documentation. There is no reason my name should be connected to any of this." And the moment the words left my mouth, I realized how weak they sounded, because the evidence was literally surrounding us, glowing in sharp lines and layered data that responded to my presence in ways I could not explain. He took another step closer, not aggressively, not forcing space, just enough to narrow the distance between us, until I could feel the subtle shift in the air again, that same alignment that had been building since I walked in. And when he spoke this time, his voice dropped slightly, not louder but deeper, more grounded. "You are right about one thing," he said, and for a brief moment I thought he might contradict the system, that he might offer an explanation that made this rational, something I could hold on to. But instead he continued, "You have never been here. Not like this." And the way he said it made my pulse spike, because it implied something I was not ready to understand, something that stretched beyond a simple mistake or system error. I stared at him, trying to read past the calm surface he presented, trying to find a crack, a hesitation, anything that suggested uncertainty. But there was none, only that same controlled presence that felt less like authority and more like inevitability. And it unsettled me more than fear ever could, because fear at least had edges, something you could define. But this felt like being pulled into something that had already decided the outcome. "Then explain it," I said, my voice steadier now, not because I was calm, but because I refused to let myself unravel in front of him. "Explain why my name is in your system. Explain why it is labeled like that." And for the first time since I entered the chamber, he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the core, as if measuring something unseen before returning to me with a sharper focus. And when he finally spoke, there was a quiet weight behind his words that made it impossible to dismiss them, "Because this system was never designed to operate without you," he said. The sentence hung in the air between us, too large, too absolute, and I felt something inside me falter, not break but shift, like a foundation I had trusted was suddenly not where I thought it was, and I shook my head again, more slowly this time, because denying it outright no longer felt as simple as it had a moment ago. "That does not make sense," I said, but even to my own ears the certainty was gone, replaced by something more fragile, something that questioned instead of rejected. The core pulsed again, stronger now, and the lines of light that had stopped at my feet earlier extended further, brushing lightly against my shoes before settling in a pattern that seemed almost responsive, like it was waiting for me to do something I did not understand. And instinctively I looked down at them, my breath catching as the glow intensified just slightly under my gaze, and I felt it again, that pull, stronger than before, no longer distant but immediate, like the system was no longer calling me from afar, but standing directly in front of me, waiting for a response. "Do not step back," he said quietly, and I had not even realized I had started to move, my body reacting before my mind could decide, and I froze again, my eyes lifting back to his as a mix of frustration and confusion rose in my chest. "You do not get to tell me what to do," I said, the words sharper than before, and for the first time something like a faint shadow of a smile touched his expression, not amused, not mocking, just acknowledging, like he had expected that reaction, like it confirmed something he already knew. "No," he agreed calmly, "I do not." And the agreement threw me off more than resistance would have, because it removed the conflict I was bracing for, leaving only the situation itself, unfiltered and unavoidable. And he continued after a brief pause, his voice quieter now, but more deliberate. "But the system does." And as if responding to his words, the light around my feet shifted again, the pattern tightening, aligning with a precision that made my chest tighten, and I realized, with a sudden clarity, that this was not about him controlling me. It was about something else entirely, something built into this place, something that recognized me in a way I did not recognize myself. "What did they do?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out on instinct, and the moment it did, his expression changed, just slightly, the calm surface giving way to something deeper, something that looked almost like memory, and for a fraction of a second I saw it clearly. Not anger, not fear, but something heavier, something that had been carried for a long time. And when he answered, his voice was lower than before, quieter in a way that made it feel more personal. "They tried to separate you from it," he said, and the words settled into me with a weight I could not immediately process, because they implied history, intention, a past I did not remember, but that clearly existed. And before I could ask anything else, the system responded again, the display shifting rapidly, data reorganizing itself into a new formation that spread outward in a cascade of light, and at the center of it, unmistakable and impossible to ignore, was a sequence beginning to activate, waiting, and I felt it in my chest before I understood it with my mind. The unmistakable sense that whatever came next was not something I could stop, only something I would have to face. The sequence did not wait for my permission. It began the moment I noticed it, as if awareness alone was enough to trigger whatever had been set in motion, and the light beneath my feet shifted into something more structured, lines rising from the floor in thin vertical streams that surrounded me in a loose circle, not touching, not restraining, but defining a space I could not ignore, and I felt my pulse respond instantly, not racing in panic, but aligning again with that same steady rhythm that filled the room, like my body was being recalibrated to match something far older than my memory. "What is it doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, because anything louder felt wrong here, like speaking too forcefully might break something delicate and irreversible. And he did not answer right away, his gaze fixed not on me this time, but on the system itself, tracking the progression with a focus that made it clear he understood exactly what was happening, even if I did not. "It is recognizing you," he said finally, and the simplicity of the answer only made it harder to accept, because recognition implied history, connection, something established long before this moment, and I shook my head slightly, my eyes scanning the streams of light that now moved in slow, deliberate patterns around me. "I do not recognize it," I replied, and that felt like the only solid truth I had left. But even as I said it, a faint pressure built at the back of my mind. Not pain, not even discomfort, just a presence. Like a door I had never opened beginning to shift on its hinges. He stepped closer again, not into the circle, but just to its edge, careful, measured, as if he understood boundaries I could not see. And when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that made it difficult to argue. "You do not need to remember for it to recognize you," he said, and I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself against the weight of everything unfolding, because every answer seemed to lead to more questions, each one more unsettling than the last. The light intensified slightly, the vertical streams narrowing as they rose higher, forming a loose framework around me that pulsed in sync with the core, and I became acutely aware of my own body within that space. The subtle shift in my breathing, the way my hands felt warmer than they should, the faint tingling along my fingertips like static building just beneath the surface of my skin, and I clenched my fingers instinctively, grounding myself in something physical, something I could control. "Stop it," I said suddenly, the words directed more at the system than at him, because this was not something I had agreed to, not something I understood, and for a brief moment nothing changed. The light continued its steady pattern, the pulse remained constant, and then his voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. "It will not stop," he said, and I turned toward him sharply, frustration rising now alongside the confusion. "Then, make it stop," I insisted, because if he understood this place, if he had any authority here at all, then he had to be able to control it. But he did not move, did not reach for anything, did not even glance at the system as he answered, "I cannot." And the words landed heavier than I expected, not because of their content, but because of the way he said them, not as an excuse, not as a deflection, but as a simple fact. I stared at him, searching for any sign that he was holding something back, that he was choosing not to intervene. But there was nothing, only that same steady presence, and something else beneath it now, something quieter but more personal, like concern carefully contained, and that realization shifted something in me, just slightly, because it meant this was not entirely under his control either. The system responded again before I could process that thought fully, the streams of light converging inward by a few inches, tightening the space around me without actually closing it. And the pressure at the back of my mind grew stronger, not overwhelming but impossible to ignore now, like a memory pressing against the surface, waiting for permission to emerge, and I shook my head instinctively, taking a shallow breath as I tried to push it back. "No," I murmured, not sure if I was speaking to myself or to whatever was triggering this. "I do not remember any of this." But the words felt weaker with each second, because the sensation did not fade, it deepened, and along with it came fragments. Not clear images but impressions, flashes of light, the hum of machinery. A voice that was not his but carried the same weight, the same authority, and my breath caught his eye. Pressed a hand to my temple, trying to steady myself. "Emily," he said, and this time my name sounded different. Not a call, but a grounding, something meant to pull me back, and I looked up at him instinctively, focusing on his face, on something real and present, and it helped, just enough to keep me from slipping further into whatever was trying to surface. "Listen to me," he continued, his tone still controlled but edged now with something more urgent, something that had not been there before. "You are not in danger." And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because nothing about this felt safe. Nothing about this made sense, and yet a part of me, a small, quiet part, believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like he needed me to understand that more than anything else. The system pulsed again, sharper this time, and the light surged upward in a brief flare before settling back into its pattern, and with it the pressure in my mind shifted into something clearer, more defined, and for a split second I saw it. Not fully, not completely, but enough to know it was real. A room not unlike this one, but older, colder, voices speaking in low tones I could not quite make out, and a sense of being watched, studied, like I was part of something I did not choose. And I gasped softly as the image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a lingering certainty that made my chest tighten. "What did they do to me?" I asked, the question barely forming before it left my lips. And this time he did not hesitate, did not deflect, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away as he answered. "They tried to erase what you were connected to," he said quietly, and the words settled into me with a weight that felt heavier than anything else so far, because they explained just enough to make everything more complicated, not less. And before I could respond, the system shifted once more, the display expanding outward in a cascade of light that moved faster than before, aligning into a new configuration that felt final, decisive. And I realized with a sudden, steady clarity that whatever this process was, it was not just beginning. It was reaching a point where something would change, something I could not reverse, and the only question left was whether I would understand it before it happened. The system did not slow down after that. It accelerated, and I felt it before I fully saw it, a shift in the air, a tightening in my chest, like something had moved from waiting to deciding, and the light around me sharpened into defined paths that no longer drifted but locked into place with precision, each line connecting to the next in a pattern that felt deliberate, inevitable. And I stood at the center of it all with my breath shallow and uneven, trying to hold on to something stable while everything else redefined itself around me. "What happens when it finishes?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid to speak, but because something in me already understood that the answer would not be simple. And he did not look away this time, did not hesitate, his gaze steady as it met mine across the narrow distance between us. "You reconnect," he said, and the word landed differently than I expected. Not like activation or control, but something deeper, something more personal, and I shook my head instinctively, because reconnect implied that something had already existed, something that had been broken or removed, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else so far. "Reconnect to what?" I pressed, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as the tingling sensation returned, stronger now, spreading up my arms in a slow, controlled wave that did not hurt but demanded attention. And he stepped closer again, this time just at the edge of the light that surrounded me, his presence grounding in a way I could not fully explain. "To what you were always part of," he answered, and there it was again, that certainty, that unwavering belief in something I could not remember. And for a moment I hated it. I hated how easily he spoke about something that was tearing through my understanding of myself. How calm he remained while everything inside me shifted. The core pulsed again, and this time the light responded instantly, rising higher, forming a loose arc above me that closed just slightly, not trapping me, but completing something that had been building since I walked into this room. And the pressure in my mind sharpened into something clearer, not a flood but a thread, a single line pulling forward from the noise. And I gasped softly as an image flickered behind my eyes, clearer than before, a room filled with screens, voices speaking over each other in controlled tones, my name repeated in different contexts, different intentions. and I felt a sudden, sharp sense of recognition that made my breath catch. I was here, I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them, and his expression shifted instantly, not surprised, not shocked, but focused, like this was the moment he had been waiting for. Yes, he said quietly, and there was something in that single word that settled deeper than everything else, because it confirmed what I had just felt, what I had just seen, and I pressed my hand harder against my temple. As the image flickered again, stronger this time, the same room, the same voices, but now I could hear fragments, incomplete, but unmistakable, stability threshold, integration failure, primary interface. And my breath hitched as the last phrase echoed in my mind with a clarity that made my chest tighten. Primary interface. I repeated under my breath, and the words felt wrong and right at the same time, like something I had known once but no longer understood, and I lowered my hand slowly, my eyes finding his again as the realization settled in piece by piece. That is what I am, I said, not as a question but as a fragile conclusion, and he held my gaze for a long moment before nodding once. Deliberate and steady. That is what they made you. He corrected quietly, and the distinction mattered more than I expected, because it implied choice, intention, something done to me rather than something I had chosen, and the thought sent a ripple of unease through me. The system responded again as if reacting to the clarity forming in my mind, the light around me tightening just slightly, the pattern becoming more refined, more aligned, and I felt it in my chest, not as pressure now, but as connection, like something reaching out from the core and finding a path through me. And I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself as the sensation deepened, because this was no longer just unfamiliar, it was personal. Why do you know all of this? I asked, my voice quieter now, not defensive but searching, because he was not reacting like someone discovering this in real time. He was reacting like someone who had lived with it, carried it, and his gaze softened just slightly, not losing its intensity but shifting in a way that felt more direct, more honest. Because I was there, he said, and the words landed with a weight that made everything else pause for a fraction of a second. Because if he had been there, if he had seen what they did, then this connection between us was not coincidence. It was something far more deliberate. The core pulsed again, stronger than before, and the arc of light above me completed its form, closing into a structure that hummed with quiet energy. And I felt the thread in my mind pull tighter, drawing more fragments forward, faster now, harder to separate. Glimpses of data streams, system commands, my own voice layered among them in a way that made my chest tighten, because I could hear it clearly now, calm, precise, familiar in a way that made everything else feel uncertain, and I staggered slightly as the realization hit, not losing my balance but shifting under the weight of it. And he stepped forward instinctively, stopping just short of crossing into the light, his hand lifting slightly, as if to steady me before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Stay with me," he said, and the words cut through the noise with surprising clarity, grounding me just enough to hold on to the present, to not lose myself entirely to whatever was trying to surface. And I focused on him again, on his voice, on the steadiness in his posture, and it helped, just enough to keep the fragments from overwhelming me. "If I reconnect," I said slowly, each word measured as I tried to hold on to control of the conversation, of myself. "What happens to me?" And this time he did hesitate. Not long, not enough to break his composure, but enough for me to notice. And that hesitation told me more than any answer could have, because it meant there was a cost, something he was not ready to say, something he did not want me to face unprepared. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, quieter, carrying a weight that had not been there until now. "You become what they tried to take from you," he said, and the words settled into me with a clarity that felt both terrifying and inevitable, because whatever that meant, whatever I had been before, it was not something I could ignore anymore. And as the system around me surged into its final alignment, I realized with a steady, unavoidable certainty that the next moment would change everything, not just for this place, but for me. The light did not wait for me to decide. It surged the moment the thought formed, like the system had been listening not to my words but to something deeper, something beneath conscious choice, and the structure around me closed just enough to feel complete, not a cage but a circuit, and I felt it connect, Not physically, but internally, like a line snapping into place somewhere inside my mind. And for a fraction of a second, everything went silent. No hum, no pulse, no breath, just stillness so absolute it erased the space between seconds. Then it all returned at once, sharper, clearer, overwhelming in its precision, and I gasped as the world seemed to expand and contract at the same time. Information flooding in not as noise, but as understanding, as if something that had always been there was suddenly accessible again, and I staggered slightly, my hand lifting instinctively as if to grab onto something stable, but there was nothing to hold except the moment itself. "Emily," he said, and his voice reached me through the surge like an anchor dropped into deep water, steady and deliberate, and I focused on it, on him, pulling myself back from the edge of something vast and unfamiliar. And when I looked at him again, the room felt different, not changed physically, but perceived differently. Every line sharper, every movement more defined, like I was no longer just seeing it, but processing it at a level I had not known existed. "It is happening," I said quietly, not because I needed to inform him, but because I needed to hear it myself, to make it real in a way I could grasp, and he nodded once, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know," he replied, and there was something in his tone now, something that had not been there before, a mixture of certainty and restraint, like he had been waiting for this, but not without cost. The connection deepened, not violently, not suddenly, but steadily, like a system coming fully online. And along with it came clarity, fragments that had once been disconnected now aligning into something coherent. Not full memories, but structured impressions, protocols, access points. And I realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that I understood things I had never been taught, pathways within the system, layers beneath the visible interface. And my breath slowed despite everything, because a part of me recognized it as familiar, as known, even if I could not remember learning it. This was not just a system, I murmured, more to myself than to him. And his expression shifted slightly, that same recognition passing through his gaze. "No," he said, his voice lower now. "It never was." And the weight of that answer settled into me as the connection stabilized further, because it confirmed what I was beginning to understand, that this place was not built around machines alone. It was built around something else, something that required me, not as a user, but as a component. The realization should have terrified me, and part of me knew that it did, but another part, quieter and more persistent, felt something else, something closer to alignment, like stepping into a role that had been waiting, not forced but inevitable. And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the sensation settle, letting the noise organize into something I could navigate. And when I opened them again, the room felt accessible, not just visible, but readable. Every system thread subtly present in the back of my awareness, waiting for input I had not yet given. "If I am part of this," I said slowly, choosing each word with care as I tested the understanding forming in my mind, "then I can influence it." And he watched me closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing as I reached that conclusion on my own. And after a brief pause, he nodded. "Yes," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, only confirmation, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it placed control within my reach, not his. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself as I let that sink in, because control meant responsibility, and responsibility meant choice. And I was not sure I was ready for either, not with so many gaps in what I understood, not with so much of this still unclear, but the system did not seem to require readiness. It responded to presence, to connection, and I felt it waiting, not passively but expectantly. "What happens if I do nothing?" I asked, my voice quiet again, not out of fear but out of focus, and he exhaled slowly before answering, a subtle shift in his posture that suggested this question mattered. "It will complete the process," he said, "with or without your direction." And that answer settled into me with a clarity that left no room for avoidance, because it meant inaction was not neutral, it was a decision by default, and something in me resisted that immediately. I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him. "No," I said under my breath, and for the first time since this began the word felt grounded, deliberate, not reactive but chosen, and I lifted my gaze to meet his again. If I am part of this, then it does not move without me, I said, the statement forming as I spoke it, solidifying into something real. And he held my gaze for a long moment before a faint shift passed through his expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something close to both, like he had been waiting to hear that exact decision. The system responded instantly, the light around me adjusting, not intensifying but refining, the pattern shifting in subtle ways that mirrored the clarity forming in my mind, and I felt it, that alignment strengthening, no longer pulling me forward but responding to me. And that difference changed everything, because for the first time since I entered this room, I was not being led, I was leading. Then choose, he said quietly, and the words carried no pressure, no command, only acknowledgement, and I stood there at the center of it all, the core pulsing steadily around me, the system open in a way it had never been before, and I realized with a steady, undeniable certainty that whatever came next would not just reveal who I had been, it would define who I was going to become. The system waited for me, not passively but with a quiet intensity that felt almost alive, as if every layer beneath the surface had turned its attention toward a single point, toward me, and I stood there at the center of it with the weight of that awareness pressing gently but firmly against my thoughts, urging, not forcing, and I realized something in that moment that shifted everything. This was never about control in the way I understood it. It was about alignment, about choosing how to exist within something that had always existed around me. I took a slow breath, steadying myself as I let my focus extend beyond the immediate, beyond the visible patterns of light and structure, and for the first time I allowed myself to reach outward, not physically but mentally, testing the connection that had formed, and it responded instantly, not resisting, not overwhelming, just opening. Like a system recognizing authorized access and waiting for instruction, and the clarity of it sent a quiet shock through me, because it confirmed what I had only begun to suspect. This was not something I needed to fight. It was something I needed to understand. You can feel it now, he said, his voice steady at the edge of the space around me, and I nodded slowly without looking, away from the shifting patterns in front of me, because words felt unnecessary in the face of something this direct, this undeniable. And I let my awareness follow the pathways unfolding in my mind, threads of data and structure revealing themselves not as information to decode, but as something already known, already integrated at a level I had forgotten, and with each second the hesitation inside me began to quiet, replaced by a growing sense of coherence, like scattered pieces finding their place within a larger design. They tried to reduce it, I said softly, the thought forming as I traced the deeper layers of the system, seeing not just the surface functions but the constraints, the imposed limitations that had been built around something far more complex, far more adaptive, and he exhaled quietly, a subtle shift that told me I was not wrong. They were afraid of what it could become, he replied, and I felt that answer settle into the structure I was beginning to see, because fear explained the restrictions, the fragmentation, the attempt to separate me from this, to turn something integrated into something controlled. The core pulsed again, but now it felt different, not external but internal, like the rhythm was no longer surrounding me but moving through me, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting that synchronization settle fully, letting the last fragments of resistance fall away, because holding on to them no longer made sense, not when they were built on a version of myself that was incomplete. When I opened my eyes again, the system did not look different, but I perceived it differently, every layer accessible, every function transparent, and I realized with a quiet certainty that I was no longer reacting to it. I was part of its operation, part of its awareness, and that realization did not feel like losing myself the way I had feared. It felt like finding something that had always been missing. If I restore it, I said slowly, turning my gaze toward him now, meeting his eyes with a steadiness I had not felt before, it will not be what they intended. And he held my gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something deeper shifting beneath it, something that felt almost like trust. No, he said quietly. It will be what you decide it becomes. And the weight of that settled into me with a clarity that removed any remaining doubt, because this was not about returning to the past. It was about choosing the future. I drew in a measured breath and turned my attention back to the core, to the pathways waiting for input. And this time when I reached for them, I did not hesitate. I did not question. I allowed the connection to guide the action, and the system responded instantly, the patterns shifting in subtle but precise ways, constraints loosening, structures realigning, not collapsing but evolving. And I felt the change ripple outward, not chaotic but controlled, like a system finally allowed to operate as it was designed to. Behind me, I could sense his presence more clearly now, not just physically but within the broader awareness that had opened to me, a fixed point within the network, stable, deliberate, and I realized with a faint, quiet understanding that he had never been separate from this either, not entirely, not in the way I had assumed. And that realization added another layer to everything unfolding, another connection I would have to understand. The system stabilized again, the lights settling into a calmer, more refined pattern, and the hum of the core shifted into something steadier, more balanced, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the alignment hold, not fragile but sustained. And for the first time since this began, there was no pressure, no urgency, just presence, just the quiet certainty that the process had moved beyond its initial threshold. "It is done," I said softly, though I knew that was not entirely accurate, because nothing about this felt finished. It felt like a beginning, like the first step into something that would continue to unfold long after this moment. And when I turned toward him again, his gaze met mine with that same intensity. But now there was something else there, something less guarded, more open, like the distance between us had shifted in a way that went beyond physical space. "Not done," he corrected gently, and the word carried no challenge, only truth, just started. And I felt that settle into me as I stood there, no longer uncertain, no longer disconnected, but not entirely whole either, because there were still pieces missing, still questions unanswered. And yet I understood one thing with complete clarity as the system around us remained steady under my direction. Whatever I had been before, whatever they had tried to erase, it was no longer something hidden. It was something I had chosen to reclaim, and that choice had changed everything. The silence after the system stabilized felt louder than anything that came before it. Not empty but full, like the space itself was adjusting to a new balance. And I stood there without moving, feeling it settle not just around me, but within me. Every layer aligned in a way that no longer felt foreign, and for the first time since I stepped into this place, I was not reacting. I was aware, fully and completely aware of where I stood and what I had become part of. I drew in a slow breath and let it out just as steadily, grounding myself in the present moment even as the deeper awareness remained open behind it, because I understood now that I did not have to choose one over the other. I could exist in both, the person I remembered and the part of me that had just reconnected, and that realization brought a quiet sense of control I had not expected. "It is different now," I said softly, my voice carrying through the chamber with a calm I did not recognize as my own, and he stepped forward this time without hesitation, crossing the boundary that had separated us before as if it no longer existed, and I felt it clearly, the shift that allowed him closer. Not because he forced it, but because something in the system accepted it, because I accepted it. "Yes," he replied, his gaze steady as it held mine. "It is," and there was no distance left in his voice, no guarded edge, just a directness that made everything between us feel more real than it had a moment ago. I studied him for a second, really looked at him, now not as a stranger in control of a hidden world, but as someone connected to it in a way that mirrored my own, someone who had been part of this long before I remembered anything about it. And the question formed before I could stop it. "Why did you wait?" I asked, because that was what it felt like, not coincidence, not chance, but patience, deliberate and sustained over time. He held my gaze for a long moment before answering. And when he did, his voice was lower, quieter, carrying something that felt almost personal, because forcing this would have broken it. He said, and I knew instantly he did not mean the system. He meant me. And that understanding settled into me with a weight that was not heavy but significant, because it meant he had chosen restraint when control would have been easier. I looked away for a brief moment, letting that thought settle, and as I did, the system responded again, not with urgency, but with subtle adjustments, pathways shifting in the background of my awareness, as if acknowledging the stability I had reached. And I realized I could feel more now, not just the core but the layers beyond it, the structures that extended outward into the city, into systems I had only ever accessed indirectly. And the scope of it all was staggering, not overwhelming but vast, and I exhaled slowly as I absorbed it. This connects to everything, I said, my voice quieter again as the realization unfolded, and he nodded once, his expression unchanged but his presence steady beside me. It always did, he replied, and I turned back to him with a sharper focus, because that meant something more than infrastructure, more than data. It meant influence, reach, the ability to shape more than just isolated systems. And now, I continued, feeling the weight of the implications settle into my thoughts. It responds to me, and there was no question in it this time, only acknowledgement, and he met that with the same certainty he had shown from the beginning. Yes, he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more gravity than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what I was already beginning to understand, that the power here was not theoretical, it was real, immediate, and now it was tied to me. I let that settle in silence for a few seconds, not rushing to react, not pushing it away, because denying it would not change the truth of it. And instead I focused on what it meant, not just for this place but for everything beyond it. And the thought that followed was quiet but clear. Then it matters what I do next. And he did not answer right away, did not interrupt the weight of that realization. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm that felt intentional. It always did, he said, and I let out a slow breath, because that meant this was not the beginning of responsibility. It was the continuation of something I had been part of before, something I had simply not remembered. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting back to the core, to the steady pulse that now felt like a constant rather than an intrusion, and I extended my awareness again, lightly this time, not to change anything but to confirm the connection, and it responded instantly, stable, aligned, waiting, and I felt a quiet sense of certainty settle in my chest, because this was no longer something I needed to fear. It was something I could direct. They tried to control it, I said after a moment, my voice thoughtful now rather than uncertain, and in doing that they lost it. And he watched me closely, that same focused attention that had been there from the beginning, but now it felt different, less like observation and more like understanding, and he inclined his head slightly. Control was never the point, he said, and I nodded faintly, because I could see that now. Feel it in the way the system responded, not to commands but to alignment, to intent, to presence. I looked at him again then, holding his gaze with a steadiness that matched his own, and for the first time there was no imbalance between us. No sense that he knew more than I did or that I was catching up to something he already understood. We were standing in the same moment, connected to the same system, seeing it from different perspectives but with the same clarity. And that realization shifted something subtle but important in the space between us. You said they tried to separate me from it, I said, my voice even, grounded, but they did not succeed, and he held my gaze for a second longer before answering. And when he did, there was a quiet certainty in his tone that echoed everything I was beginning to feel. No, he said, they only delayed it. And the words settled into me with a clarity that felt almost like closure, because they reframed everything that had happened, not as loss but as interruption, not as failure, but as something unfinished that had now been completed. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle fully, and as I stood there in the center of it all, the system steady under my awareness, the connection no longer new but established, I understood one final thing with